March 12, 1945, a frozen railway depot outside Hamburg. The corporal's breath hung in the air as he gripped the bolt cutters, the metal chain snapping with a sound like a gunshot echoing through the abandoned yard. Behind the rusted door, something moved in the darkness. Not the shuffle of hidden soldiers or the creak of forgotten cargo, but the unmistakable sound of human suffering. The smell hit him first, thick and suffocating, a mixture of unwashed bodies, waste, and fear so concentrated it seemed to coat his throat. Then his eyes adjusted to the shadows, and he saw them. 21 women pressed against the wooden walls like trapped animals, and in the center, chained to a metal beam, one woman stared back at him with eyes that expected only cruelty. She had been told exactly what British soldiers would do to her. Every propaganda broadcast, every poster, every whispered warning had prepared her for this moment. But nothing had prepared her for what he actually said. Before we continue, this is a story that deserves to be heard, a moment of humanity in the darkest chapter of human history. If this moves you, hit that like button and subscribe so more people can discover these forgotten stories, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, because these accounts belong to all of us, no matter where we call home. Now, back to that frozen morning in Hamburg. The woman chained to that beam was Katharina Steinberg, a 24-year-old auxiliary nurse whose crime was speaking 6 words that her government considered treason. She had urged fellow Germans to stop fighting, to lay down their weapons and end the madness. For that, a Nazi officer had ordered her locked in a freight car without food or water, her wrists shackled to an iron support beam, positioned just low enough that she couldn't stand, couldn't sit, couldn't rest. 6 days she had remained in that position, her legs trembling from exhaustion, her throat raw from thirst, her mind fracturing between the pain of her body and the terror of what would come next. The other women shared her fate, though not her chains. They were nurses, clerks, telephone operators, women who had worked for the Wehrmacht in non-combat roles, and now found themselves abandoned by the regime they had served. In those 6 days, 3 women had died. Their bodies still lay in the corner, covered with torn blankets, because no one had come to remove them. No one had come at all, until Corporal Thomas Henley forced open that door, and everything Katharina believed about enemies and humanity shattered in a single moment. Henley was 32 years old, a farm boy from Yorkshire who had seen more death in 3 years than most men witness in a lifetime. He had waded through the surf at Normandy, watched friends burn alive in disabled tanks, cleared German positions house by house through shattered French towns where every doorway might hide a machine gun nest. The war had carved lines into his face that made him look a decade older. His hands bore scars from shrapnel, frostbite, and 100 small cuts that came from living in holes in the ground. But those same hands had also pulled wounded men from burning vehicles, shared his last cigarette with a dying German teenager who called for his mother, and carried French children to safety through artillery barrages that turned streets into moonscapes. 3 years of combat had not made him cruel. It had simply shown him what cruelty looked like, and taught him to recognize the difference between soldiers who fought because they believed and soldiers who fought because they had no choice. His patrol that morning was routine, the kind of grinding, methodical work that followed major advances. Field Marshal Montgomery's 21st Army Group had pushed the Wehrmacht back across the Rhine. What remained was the cleanup, the documentation, the slow process of cataloging what the enemy had left behind. 15 men moved with Henley through the depot, their boots crunching on gravel, coated with frost that glittered in the weak morning sunlight. They had checked 6 freight cars already, abandoned ammunition, medical supplies that would never reach field hospitals, stacks of uniforms for soldiers who would never wear them. The German war machine was bleeding out, leaving its lifeblood scattered across the landscape in a trail of abandoned logistics. Then they reached the 7th car, and Private Robert Mitchell called out that something was wrong. The chains were the first sign. Heavy links wrapped around the door handles and secured with a padlock that had been deliberately, carefully locked from the outside. Henley studied it for a long moment, his experienced eyes reading the situation the way a hunter reads tracks in snow. The Germans abandoned everything now. They didn't secure it. They didn't lock it. They certainly didn't waste chains and padlocks on empty freight cars. Whatever was inside, someone had wanted it to stay there. The chain snapped. The door shrieked open on rusted wheels, and the smell that rolled out made Mitchell stagger backward, his hand flying to his mouth. It wasn't death, not quite, but something almost worse. The concentrated reek of human beings trapped in their own filth for days without relief, without dignity, without hope. Henley stepped inside slowly, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness after the pale outdoor light. Shapes resolved into people. Women in torn auxiliary uniforms, their faces hollow with starvation and fear. Some raised their arms defensively, expecting blows. Others simply stared with the blank emptiness of people who had moved beyond terror into a kind of numb waiting. And there, in the center, was Katharina. The chains held her in a half-crouch, her legs shaking visibly from days of supporting her weight in that impossible position. Her nurse's uniform was filthy, torn at the shoulder, streaked with blood and grime. Her dark blonde hair hung in matted tangles around a face so gaunt that her cheekbones cast shadows in the dim light. But her eyes, those eyes, still held something. Not quite hope. Hope had died days ago, but a kind of defiant refusal to break completely, even as her body gave out. She looked at Henley, and every propaganda broadcast she had ever heard roared through her mind. The British are savages. They torture prisoners. They show no mercy to women. Death would be preferable to what they will do. She had spent 6 days preparing herself for this moment, building mental walls, deciding that she would die before she gave them the satisfaction of seeing her beg. Her muscles tensed despite their exhaustion. Her breathing quickened despite her thirst. And then Corporal Thomas Henley did something that destroyed every certainty she had built to protect herself from this moment. He lowered his rifle, set it against the doorframe, stepped forward slowly, carefully, like a man approaching an injured animal that might bolt. And he crouched down until his eyes were level with hers, until they were simply 2 human beings looking at each other across the wreckage of a war neither of them had chosen. And in clear, simple English, he asked her a question. "When did you last eat?" 4 words. Not, "Where are your commanders?" Not, "What intelligence do you have?" Not, "Why are you chained here?" Not even, "Who are you?" Just 4 words spoken with genuine concern, with the kind of basic human compassion that recognizes suffering and wants to ease it. "When did you last eat?" The question hung in the frozen air of that freight car like something tangible, something that could be touched. Katharina stared at him. Her mouth opened. No sound came. Her mind, which had prepared for cruelty, for interrogation, for violence, had no framework for processing kindness. The walls she had built, the defenses she had constructed, the resignation she had achieved, all of it collapsed in that instant. And she broke, not with screams or hysteria, but with the quiet, devastating tears of someone whose suffering has finally been acknowledged. Her shoulders shook. Tears cut clean tracks through the grime on her face. And still no words would come, only sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her lungs, from a place where she had stored 6 days of agony and terror, and the certainty that she would die alone and forgotten in this frozen metal tomb. Henley didn't move, didn't press her, didn't demand answers. He simply stayed there, crouched at her level, waiting. Behind him, Mitchell shifted uncomfortably, uncertain what to do with this moment that felt more intimate than anything they had encountered in 3 years of combat. Minutes passed. The other women watched in silence, their own certainties beginning to crack. Slowly, Katharina's sobs quieted, though her body still trembled. She looked at Henley through tear-streaked eyes, and he looked back with the same steady, patient expression. Not pity, not disgust, just recognition. One human being seeing another. Henley rose carefully and called for Mitchell to bring the bolt cutters. He ordered someone to radio for medical assistance, explaining that they had civilian prisoners in critical condition. When Mitchell cut the chain tethering Katharina to the beam, she collapsed immediately, her legs finally freed from 6 days of impossible strain. The shackles remained on her wrists, but at least she could move, could breathe, could begin to believe that perhaps she might survive this after all. What Katharina didn't know, what none of the women knew, was that Henley's question wasn't unusual. It was standard. British forces had been trained explicitly in the treatment of prisoners, in maintaining the standards of the Geneva Convention, even when facing an enemy that had systematically violated it. This wasn't exceptional kindness. This was simply the baseline of how soldiers were expected to behave. But to women who had been told for years that the British were monsters, who had been fed a steady diet of propaganda about Allied brutality, who had been chained in a freight car by their own government and left to die, basic human decency felt like a miracle. The contrast between what they expected and what they received was so profound that it didn't just surprise them. It fundamentally altered their understanding of reality. Everything they had been told was a lie, and if that was a lie, what else was false? What else had they believed without questioning? Within an hour, medical personnel arrived. Lieutenant Sarah Whitmore, a nurse from Manchester, took charge with brisk efficiency. She examined the prisoners methodically, noting dehydration, malnutrition, infected wounds, and in Katharina's case, deep lacerations around her wrists, where the shackles had cut through skin to raw flesh. Mitchell spent 15 careful minutes removing those shackles without causing additional injury, working the bolt cutters with surgical precision. When the metal finally fell away, Katharina stared at her freed wrists as if they belonged to someone else, her fingers trembling as they touched the inflamed skin. Fresh tears came, silent this time. Tears not of pain, but of relief so profound it hurt more than the wounds themselves. By midday, hot soup and bread arrived from the field kitchen. The women stared at the food in disbelief. They hadn't eaten in 5 days. Some hesitated, certain this must be a trick, that the food would be snatched away or that eating it would bring punishment. But hunger won, and one by one they accepted the bowls and ate with a desperation that spoke of starvation reaching its final stages. Henley personally brought Katharina her portion. She looked up at him, her eyes still wary despite everything, still waiting for the trap to spring. He simply set the bowl in her hands and stepped back, giving her space. The soup was nothing special, just broth with vegetables and bits of meat. The kind of simple field ration that soldiers ate every day without thinking. But to Katharina, who had consumed nothing but her own saliva for nearly a week, it was the most incredible thing she had ever tasted. Each swallow felt like life returning to her body, warmth spreading through her stomach, her mind clearing from the fog of starvation. Around her, other women cried while they ate, or laughed in short, desperate bursts that sounded more like sobs. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. They had been told these men were savages. But savages didn't feed their prisoners. Savages didn't remove their chains. Savages didn't ask when you last ate and then wait patiently for an answer while you broke down from the simple recognition of your humanity. Everything was backwards. Everything was wrong. Or rather, everything they had been told was wrong, and reality was finally asserting itself through the fog of propaganda. By late afternoon, trucks arrived to transport them to a repurposed German military facility 4 miles away. The women were helped aboard carefully, their weakened legs barely able to manage the step-up. Katharina was the last to board. Henley stood at the truck's gate, his hand extended to help her up. She hesitated, staring at that offered hand. In that moment, she made a choice. She took it. His hand was warm, calloused, firm, real. She whispered one word in German, "Danke." "Thank you." He nodded, understanding the word, if not the full depth, of what she was thanking him for. "You're welcome," he replied in English. Two people speaking different languages but understanding each other perfectly. The truck pulled away. Henley watched it go, then turned back to his patrol. There were still more cars to check, more work to do. For him, this was just another day in the grinding process of ending a war. But for Katharina, watching through the truck's canvas opening as the depot receded into the distance, this was the day her entire worldview shattered and rebuilt itself around a single question asked with genuine compassion. The facility felt like impossible luxury after 6 days in that freight car. Real beds with mattresses, even if they were thin and standard-issue military. Running water that came out of taps. Toilets that flushed. Heat that flowed through radiators, instead of freezing metal walls that leached warmth from your body. Through a translator, Lieutenant Whitmore explained the situation with clinical clarity. They were prisoners of war. They would be treated according to the Geneva Convention. 3 meals a day, medical care. Light duties if they were able, no forced labor, no abuse. The rules were simple and would be enforced. Katharina listened and realized that these standards, these basic expectations of human treatment, were higher than what her own government had provided in those final months of the war. German civilians were starving, receiving perhaps 800 calories per day if they were lucky. Here, as a prisoner, she would receive 1,800. More than twice what her own mother was eating, if her mother was even still alive. Days settled into a pattern. Katharina worked in the infirmary under Lieutenant Whitmore's supervision, her nursing skills proving invaluable despite the language barrier. The two women developed a relationship built on mutual respect and professional competence, communicating through gestures, basic German-English vocabulary, and the universal language of medical care. Katharina's wounds healed slowly. The lacerations on her wrists left scars that would remain for the rest of her life, permanent bracelets marking those 6 days. But her body recovered faster than her mind. At night she lay in her clean bed, her stomach full, her body warm, and guilt crushed her with suffocating weight. What right did she have to be comfortable when her country was burning, when German children were starving in cellars while Allied bombs fell overhead, when her own family, wherever they were, probably had nothing? 3 weeks into her imprisonment, a letter arrived. The Red Cross tracked her through the chaos of a collapsing Reich. Katharina recognized her mother's handwriting, and her hands shook. Her father was dead, killed in an air raid on Hamburg. Her 17-year-old brother was missing on the Eastern Front. Her mother survived on grass soup in a basement. Everything else was gone. Katharina sat in a warm room, clean sheets around her, beef stew heavy in her stomach. The guilt crushed her. That night she could not eat. Lieutenant Whitmore read the letter through a translator and spoke gently. "Starving yourself will not help your mother. Stay strong so you can help her later." The logic was clear. The guilt was stronger. A month after liberation, the British gathered the women in a hall. A projector flickered to life. They were shown what had been done in Germany's name: Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Auschwitz. Corpses stacked like wood, living skeletons. Children aged into ghosts, shoes piled into mountains. Hair, teeth, ashes. Numbers followed. Millions murdered. Silence filled the room. Katharina forced herself to watch. Others cried or whispered that they had not known. An officer answered coldly, "Now you know. You can never claim ignorance again." That night she understood the truth. People had chosen not to see. She had chosen not to see. The next day, Corporal Henley sat beside her. She asked how anyone could forgive such things. He said forgiveness was impossible, but responsibility mattered. You did not kill anyone. She argued that looking away was also a choice. He agreed. The only path forward was to never look away again. 6 months later, the war ended. Hamburg was rubble. Katharina found her mother alive. She worked in ruined hospitals, treating diseases reborn by hunger. She married, had children, and raised them to question authority. Years later, she told her grandchildren about the freight car. She expected cruelty and met compassion. Kindness destroyed the lies she believed. It taught her humanity survives even in darkness. Sometimes the strongest weapon is not violence, but a simple question asked with care. "When did you last eat again?"